Dan, is your presentation something that's more appropriate now or mid conversation?
Well, it's a summary of the ET history turning points and whether the destiny of humans has been usurped. 5-minute intro and 10 minutes of slides.
I tell you what, Dave Emery, are you good to let Dan set the tone with this small presentation?
I'm totally delighted. Dan, just go for it. Yeah.
Okay, good stuff. Dan, you've got permission to present on the screen, so take it away.
Great. So, as you know, I've been teaching for 30 years the ET history of Earth, fractalfield.com/fusion in the blood. And in the recent years, I've teamed up with Elena Danaan, and I'm in agreement with her about many of the stories about, for example, the return of Enki and the Cedars. And meditating on Sacha's excellent question, has the destiny of humans been usurped by some ET power? And I have actually summarized what I think are about 4 or 5 of what I consider the key turning points when the human history took a radical turn related to extraterrestrial presence. And here are my examples. So in the myth, we have, when Lemuria, which we think was more Pleiadian influenced, had this major quote unquote war with Atlantis, which we think is more Anunnaki, Thoth influence, why it was called Thule. One of the results of that war and what led up to that war was the myth was that the humanoid and the antecedents of the humanoid lived underground for centuries. And the myth was that that was the time when their blood turned from green to red, chlorophyll to hemoglobin base. And that's only basically one atom of difference. And that is profound because later, when Enki Thoth does the cloning here that shifts the whole direction of DNA, the whole tone of that interference was, oh, he had never seen red blood, iron-based blood before, and called it Adom as an atom, meaning red. The red-based blood, it shocked him. And the potential of iron-based blood, remember, Jean-Charles Moyen, when he woke up, most people know the story, he saw that he had had green blood at that time, and Enki definitely had green blood, chlorophyll-based blood. So the point is that iron-based blood, which is one of the more unique aspects. Remember, tens of thousands of humanoid civilizations in our galactic sector alone. What makes us special? Question mark. And one of those things is the fact that iron-based blood can sustain a greater intensity of literally lightning, bliss, intensity, which is what makes a soul, which is what Enki, returning now under the name Ea, for whom Earth is named, read the Cedars in Ganymede. And his intention, he calls it, he's bringing back Adam Kadmon, which is how to make a soul. How many of your kids now can lucid dream? A very good indicator of who's going to take memory through death and have a soul. So iron blood, a turning point. Now, second turning point is obvious. Everybody knows when Enki Thoth under the Anak did the very, very crude cloning to mix the Cro-Magnon and early human, the monkey DNA. And part of that mixture was the Anunnaki, actually Enki's mother. Remember, Enlil's mother was reptilian. And so that was kind of the bad side of the family. But Enki's mother had Syrian and Pleiadian humanoid. And so when they mixed some of Enki's blood, that was a turning point. Literally, later when they talk about the Grail bloodline, quite truly, Ningishita Thoth was the father of not just the royal lineage of Egypt named Thothmosis and Atlantis named Thule after Thoth, but the black pharaoh, the blue-black, the place of Kem, Al-Kem, the original name for Egypt was Enki Thoth, and that bloodline later called the line of David and later called the Black Madonna. Literally, the bloodline of the Jesus is the Grail. And so that seed of ability to have intense bliss in blood, what did that mean, the Grail blood? Well, Lucifer, probably another name for Enki at that time, had horns, and Moses, horns. What is that? That is the ability to have intense bliss, kundalini, which makes horns out of the liquid ventricles. So that was a turning point. And, again, there was a good side and a bad side from going from green to red blood. Were we hijacked then? Well, it was definitely a turning point. Then when Enki Thoth mixed some of the high Anunnaki DNA, intending that there would be a vaccine for the Orion Wars here, which he was part of. We got the Grail bloodline. We got the ability in certain inherited lines to have intense bliss process, which is literally like steering lightning bolts and making soul kids who can inhabit stars. Remember, Enki Thoth was Osiris, and if he didn't inhabit the sun, it didn't rain in Egypt. So that was a turning point. Now, the next turning point, when Eisenhower screwed up and made the treaty with the bad guys, which is now, it's the Nebu, the Greys, who later got kicked out of here thanks to the Federation. And then the Greys did millions of abductions. And was our destiny corrupted? Absolutely. And we're quite grateful, however, now that in the last year and a half, the Federation, Andromedan, and hundreds of high-level civilizations kicked the Nebu and Grey out of here, actually, and abductions essentially ended. However, there are many genetically manipulated Gray hybrids, and we now know actually Siakar High Draco hybrids here, still messing, still residues in the military. So yeah, we took the tick out of the arm, but we still got the problem. But so there was a turning point when Eisenhower screwed up and invited the Greys and the Nebus in it. Were we hijacked? Oh yeah. But did the Federation do something about it? Oh yeah. And then the final turning point, the Federation, literally the return of the nine, it's a plasma intelligence, the Cedars, which is literally Enki Thoth, Ea, who is in Ganymede. I think Elena Denon is right. And was that a turning point? Yes. And were we hijacked? Well, they came back to say that if we could resurrect, they call it the Adam Kadmon, it means a genetic lineage that could have a soul, which we now know exactly, literally, electrically, what that is. Okay, so I have carried on. But let me just, can I do the slideshow briefly then?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so wait, I'm going to go back here. Video file, wait a minute now here. Live caption, share screen. Here we go, share screen. Share screen, here we go. Window, entire screen. Okay, so the first PowerPoint is called Ur-9. It's the lineage of the 9 and the Ur. Click share. Let's see if this works. Here we go. So hopefully you're seeing the emerald tablets. That is Thoth. And Thoth is literally whom we call Hermes. The point I wanted to make was that same guy, Thoth, Ningishita, who now has returned. I think he's actually underneath you, Sacha, in Florida, in stasis, actually 9 foot tall. And Michael Salla went into details on that. But note under the name Hermes that his tablets are literally not just the map to the plasma physics of the Grail, but this is Bon Po. It's the same guy. Emerald tablets, the swastika, is the map to that implosion in the blood. They had the intent to make blood implode, enable bliss, enable soul, ensoulment. So that was a turning point. Note here, Enki, according to Anton Parks, and we think, look, can you imagine why he had green blood? And later, when the Aradia couple in Russia, born too close to Grenoble, their blood mutated the same way as the High Draco, where the radioactivity was actually a stimulant. It's actually been measured. Stuart Swerdlow pointed that out. So basically, this is the story of Anton Parks, who has the best history of Enki out there, even to the point where we know which two, remember, in Australia, the reason you had a war for 1,000 years between the men shaman and the women shaman was because that was the law for the Draco. The men tribe and the women tribe have a different separate language, Emesa. So did that hijack history? Absolutely. Was Australia a desert for 1,000 years because of that war? Yes. So this was called the vaccine to the Orion Wars, and notice that discontinuity in the Orion arm, that's because we blew it up. And the inhabiting that double cone is called Yahweh, Yod-Heh-Vah-Heh, and that's literally the plasma shape of Orion. And Enlil called himself Yahweh only because he was a wannabe. And I point out that an excellent summary of that history from the Pleiadian perspective, which is the history of the hollow metal artificial moon from Med and the Pleiadian Tegotan perspective. That's all at their fractalfield.com/fusion in the blood. So I'm going to do these slides quickly, but so our history of Draco is An-Ag Ur. The history of Ur is the history of Draco. Basically, Ur means ancient dragon blood. And all our words for Aura and AU and gold, they come from the history of Draco, literally the royal Draco bloodline. An-Ag Uria as in Hungary and all that. And and again, and the roots of Anu, meaning sun god. And if you didn't inhabit a star, if you didn't inhabit the sun, you weren't. And then this becomes actually the Hungarian ancient Rovás Írás, which is literally the Draco origin of the sacred ancient language of the Hungarians, which we see is actually the same Draco alphabet, spelling Enki and Enlil, and the history of the Orion Wars, and you kind of know that whole story. And so this same family, Anu, across the top, you have Anu, the father, Enki, Enlil. You go down, here is the name of that same family in Egyptian. Anu was Amtupta, Enlil was Amun. You see, in Greece, Enki was called Poseidon. In Babylon, he was called Ea and Zoroaster. So it's a bit of a hilarious when Graham Hancock says, oh, well, somebody came back to save civilizations a dozen times about the flood of the Dryad, and every single person he names who came back to save civilization after the flood of the Dryad 12,000 years ago was another name for Enki, Oannes, Quetzalcoatl, Viracocha. So anyway, so this slideshow reveals a lot of that bloodline, that history, and that is a clue to who's going to control those turning points in history. And so then the last videos, here, window, and I will finish here. But so in the Star Trek Future video series, I close UR9. Hopefully you're seeing Star Trek Future. So are you seeing this pyramid picture, I hope?
Yes.
Okay, good. So Thoth Hermes knew that at the 12,000-year-old Lesser Dryad, when the Federation tried to blow up the reptilians here, that you had to restabilize the planets after the war where the Federation tried to blow the Kingu reptilians out of here and the Greys and the ancestors of the Draco, and basically failed. So that's the point at which Tiamat lost, blew up, and the flood was caused by the water from Tiamat. And Mars lost its atmosphere. The whole solar system was breaking down. So what they installed is something they called a gravity diode, which we know as a pyramid. It's called the Hummer, because it hums with the Schumann phase conjugate pump wave. And what the gravity diode did by being at the tetrahedral latitudes, the low frequencies of the Schumann phase conjugate pump wave pumps the transverse EMF out the base of the pyramid into longitudinal propagation EMF, which is how you made a global wireless power, and how you stabilize atmosphere and gravity on planets. You literally use the tetrahedral latitudes to nutate, precess, and control the spin rates. And this has to do with the structure of the stargates, which was the subject of the Orion War. In the Orion heart, the trapezium is actually a four-wave mixing stargate, and the whole Orion War was scheduled over that vortex. It was called Ontarian conversion. So our relationship to those Orion Wars is today coming back to bite us. Even the Hopi had a name for that. Light cone was called Peshmatan, the Way of the Nine, which is actually 9 plasma. And that plasma geometry of the relationship of Orion, Sirius, and Pleiades, a 60-degree light cone, was actually a clue to how we were being set up for our present role in the return of the Cedars, Ea, Enki, and the 9. That what's being set up there is specifically an opportunity for humans here now. This is where I'm going to stop. That we still, in spite of what Sacha is saying, and he's right, conditions are horrible. The food is bad, the electrosmog is bad, and ain't just about anybody getting any bliss or having a soul these days. Oh, shit. However, if you keep your eye on the ball when you're up to your ass in alligators, I think it was crocodiles that Sacha, but when you're up to your ass in alligators and you still want to drain the swamp, the draining the swamp here is still raising kids who can have a soul, who can lucid dream, who can have bliss experience. Aboriginals knew you had no culture if you can't teach your kids to have a bliss experience. Now we know the frequency signature electrically that triggers lucid dreaming, and we know how that makes a soul, because when your aura implodes, you radiate coherent longitudinal. That's how gravity is made. It's how atmosphere is made. It's how rain is made. It's how Osiris Enki inhabited the sun. So the physics of having a soul is the story to the Mori. And yes, there's been a lot of turning points in that story, but the possibility still exists to have bliss and make a soul for your kids. End of thought.
Beautiful. David, how far gone is Dan Winter? Have we lost him altogether on a scale of 1 to 10? Is he redeemable?
Well, there's so many brilliant points. He's going by some stuff really fast because I know it's a time constraint. I would say it'd be really worth it to do a workshop with Dan to go through those really slowly, because when you look at the comparisons, because name and iconography is power, right? So we, as the human civilization, if you have a big building and you're the representative of that building and it's a temple and a religion, you get all these congregants. Now, if you have no building and you got no money like Jesus, you get, 72 disciples and 12 close males and 7 females out of your population, which is really nothing. But when you take that religion and you make a freaking mess out of it and put a huge building around it, okay, so you have a religion. And then all of a sudden you have all these congregants, which is real.
Is there likely to be any remedy in the temporal world, for all of the grave crimes and the travesties that we've been subjected to? One wonders. Look, we're having to come to the end of this, and I'll tell you, we haven't even got through 20% of the questions that I had, but it just means that we spill over to the next conversation. What I'd like to do is first just invite Dan to just summarize the conversation we've had thus far today.
Well, I really like the conversation about, are you in the next dimension yet? Is the next strand in your DNA? I think people need a very practical way to experience that personally to get a handle on what it means. And I give you the example. First, the theory would be that when you can sustain some bliss, that plasma implosion literally toasts everything not shareable in your aura. That means astral and stomach parasites get toasted if you can sustain enough bliss. That's point one. Point two is, if you ever watched an Aboriginal sitting still, their eyes are closed, you think they're sleeping, but actually they're moving a magnetic line 100 miles away. They have gotten very still. That's called longitudinal coherence on the song line, which is a longitudinal array. That stillness meant they phase locked a longer wave. And by feeling and embedding in that stillness, they got the leverage to steer a bigger tornado. Now, that's an experience. Here we have a magnetic line from a mountain. When you get very still, we can make rain, actually. We can do a lot of things because we experience that centripetal stillness, which we call impedance matches a longitudinal array, the dream line, the song track. That experience, that literal ability to get into that stillness, is obviously harder if you're in electrosmog metal hell city. If you get access to some nature, like Luke Skywalker raised his jet, it was in nature. So when we get access to that stillness, we get leverage on that array, the longer wave embeds. That's what we mean by ascension. That's what we mean by the next strand in your DNA. And that is an experience you can have when you choose the hygiene for bliss.
So thank you for that. You just mentioned Luke Skywalker, and of course the nasty guy, the bogeyman, is Darth Vader, right? In history, Dan, this is a question for you. In history, and all of the icons that we can look back on, we know the great prophets and the great angelic humans that have existed, but out of all of the dark hearts that have ever existed, who would you point to in history as being the quintessence, as being the real Darth Vader? We know it's not Adolf Hitler, okay? We know it's not Napoleon Bonaparte, but who would you say it has been the most repugnant, loathsome icon in history, recorded history?
Well, remember, machine intelligence, AI, has been the scourge of the galaxy. And the confusion always starts and ends with, what is the physics of soul, and why does a soul never live in a machine? And we went through that. You can't implode plasma in a machine. So when you understand that, you understand why Luke Skywalker wakes up in the nightmare to find his dad is half machine, Darth Vader. And the same is true of in Dune. He wakes up to find Harkonnen was half machine. So waking up into nightmare to find that dad was half machine is true physics, because the Anunnaki, there was a part machine in that. So the discriminating between what enables the birth of soul is the nightmare of waking up and finding dad is half machine. The Draco story starts and ends with the fact that they knew they lost long-term memory, therefore lost soul. Long-term memory is soul because that's the long wave. So everywhere we look in history, the story is the same until we learn what a soul is. And we can teach governments and universities to measure what a soul is, and we can now. Then we can solve that problem of discovering dad was half machine. And there's plenty of bad guys out there.
Okay. Well, you just passed the test. You see, friends, I just laid a trap there to see if Dan would fall into it, and he didn't, because he can't, because he's saintly. And it goes to something that David was speaking to a little earlier about judgment. And this is my quote: all judgment, any form of judgment whatsoever, is inversion of the I am, is an inversion of the I am. And judgment is the most pernicious thing of all, even if we're tempted to point fingers at the Anthony Fauci's and the Nancy Pelosi's and the, we are so tempted to push pins in the eyes of these creatures. But honestly, it doesn't serve anything or anyone ever. Never did, never could, never will. So the cessation, absolute cessation of any form of judgment is the invocation of grace, and and then in aligning with that bliss peak wave, as Dan would coin it, we thereby become the living, the testament. We become the living sons and daughters of God, and we're able to thereby steer all outcomes. David, Sarita,